Whenever I try to picture a king from history, especially like those old school absolute power types, my brain just immediately defaults to this very specific, very loud archetype.
Let me guess. You're picturing Henry VIII.
Exactly. Henry VIII, or just that whole vibe of a guy who is powerful, incredibly ambitious, and let's be honest, usually pretty messy.
Messy is putting it lightly. We're sort of conditioned to see them as these larger-than-life figures who conquered lands and, well, usually conquered a lot of hearts along the way.
Or really broke a lot of marriage vows.
Right. And history loves a scandal. It creates a compelling narrative. Plus, you have that old saying, absolute power corrupts absolutely.
We just assume that when someone can do whatever they want, they will do whatever they want.
Mm-hmm.
But today we're doing something completely different. We are looking at a stack of research that just flips that script entirely. We're doing a deep dive into a source called Crowns of Commitment, Royal Fidelity Through History. And I have to say, it's kind of blowing my mind.
It's a fascinating premise.
Because it asks a question I never really thought to ask. What happens when you have the world at your feet, basically zero accountability, and you choose to be faithful anyway?
Yeah, usually we look at history through the lens of what these men took. Territory, wealth, power. This source asks us to look at what they resisted.
Which, spoiler alert, turns out to be a much harder battle than winning a war. So our mission for this deep dive is to explore these hidden stories of 4 British kings who stayed faithful.
And the source makes this really interesting point right away.
It does. It says that for these men, fidelity wasn't just, being good. It was a radical act.
I love that phrasing, a radical act, because if you think about the context, these men lived in environments designed to cater to their every single whim.
Right. There's no HR department in the 19th century royal court.
Exactly. There's none to tell you no. So to refuse temptation when you're literally the king, that's not about following rules. You make the rules. It's about a profound internal battle.
That is such a crucial distinction. It's not about fear of getting caught. Who's going to catch the king?
Precisely. This isn't about battles or conquests on a map. As the source highlights, this is about the quiet, much harder battle of personal restraint.
Okay, so let's unpack this. We've got 4 specific kings to talk about, and I want to start with one that really surprised me. On the surface, he seems like the exact type of guy who would have been a playboy.
You're talking about King Edward VII.
Yes, let's talk about Edward VII.
The source calls him the charm devotee.
Charm devotee. It sounds so
Sure.
fancy. But the description here is of a man of sophistication, wit, and influence. It's painting this picture of a guy who is the life of the party, right?
Totally. Surrounded by European courts, whispering socialites. The text literally says he was surrounded by intrigue and tempting affairs.
So you have to understand the era. He wasn't isolated in a monastery. He was right in the thick of high society at its most decadent.
Okay, so let's set the scene. You have this charming, powerful guy with every opportunity to indulge. And people probably expected him to have a wandering eye.
In fact, based on the source, wouldn't it have been weird if he didn't?
That's the crux of it. The source argues that despite all that pressure and opportunity, he remained steadfast to Queen Alexandra.
But here's where it gets nuanced.
Yeah.
It says he chose consistency over desire. That word consistency is so unglamorous, isn't it?
It sounds like something you look for in a mutual fund, not a king.
I love you because you're consistent.
Right, but in a royal court, consistency is a rare commodity. Everyone is vying for position, changing alliances. To be consistent in your affections is actually quite stabilizing.
Okay, here is where it gets really interesting for me, and I want your take on this. The source talks about the risk he took, but it flips it. It says Edward risked public ridicule for restraint.
That stopped me in my tracks when I read it, too. It's a very counterintuitive idea. We forget that in certain social circles, especially the cool kids of the royal court decadence, was the norm.
It was the currency of power.
Mm-hmm. If you weren't participating in the affairs and the gossip, you weren't just good. You were kind of outside the loop.
You were boring. You were the guy drinking water at the keg stand.
Worse than boring, you were socially isolated. By not participating, Edward risked isolation from his peers. The source notes he risked lost opportunities and public ridicule.
Imagine being the most powerful man in the room, but everyone thinks you're a bit of a prude because you actually like your wife.
It's wild to think that being a faithful husband could get you made fun of, but that was the world he lived in. It's peer pressure at the highest possible level.
So the takeaway for Edward is basically Fidelity isn't always glamorous. It's quiet, it's deliberate, and it's actually an act of defiance against the social norms of his time.
Defiance is the right word. It's standing in a room full of smoke and refusing to inhale.
Which brings us perfectly to our next king. The atmosphere around him was just as intense, but the stakes felt a little different. Let's move on to William IV.
William IV. The source uses him as a case study in duty before desire.
Okay, so he came a bit before Edward VII, and the source mentions he was in an envied position. Again, privilege and power. But there's this specific phrase the text uses, isolation from scandal-driven peers.
It seems to be a thing here, doesn't it, that being good is actually kind of lonely.
It is. The text notes that William IV lived in a world where most men would fail to resist temptation. It frames his fidelity not as a default setting, but as an active choice.
He chose honor over indulgence.
But let's dig into that isolation bit. Why does being faithful make you isolated? Is it just because you leave the party early?
Well, think about how court politics worked. Information was traded in the bedroom as much as the boardroom. Mistresses were often gatekeepers of influence.
Yeah.
So if the entire court, all these scandal-driven peers, are operating on that wavelength, and you choose to step out of that game, you are effectively removing yourself from the inner circle.
You're killing the vibe.
Yeah.
And you're closing off channels of information.
In a way, yes. You become an outsider in your own court. The source points out that he had to maintain public trust despite personal desire. That implies a heavy burden.
It does. And the source gives us a definition of love here that I think is really powerful. It says, for William, love wasn't just passion. It was commitment, restraint, and integrity.
That trio of words is crucial. Commitment, restraint, integrity. We often think of royal romances in terms of grand gestures or, fiery passion.
Right.
But William V teaches us that loyalty is principled, not dramatic.
Not dramatic. I feel like reality TV could learn a lesson from William IV.
Yeah.
It's not about the rose ceremony. It's about the Tuesday night dinner.
Exactly. But that's the point. Real, enduring love, the kind that survives the pressure of a crown, isn't about the fireworks. It's about the structure.
So we've got Edward dealing with ridicule, William dealing with isolation. Now I want to move to a time period where the whole world was basically falling apart. Let's talk about George V.
George V. The text titles this section, Loyalty in the Shadow of War.
The backdrop here shifts dramatically. We aren't just in a decadent ballroom anymore. The source lists it out. World War I, massive political unrest, the fall of empires, everything is chaos.
Absolutely. The source shifts gears here from the personal cost to the political function of loyalty.
Right. It notes that while the world was in upheaval, George V's marriage to Queen Mary remained unshakable.
Unshakable. That's a strong word when empires are literally collapsing around you.
It is. And here's the so what of this segment. Why does it matter that a king is faithful when there's a literal world war happening? Who cares?
You'd think the public has bigger fish to fry.
Yeah.
But the source explains that his loyalty wasn't just a personal virtue, it was a story of survival. He modeled stability in a turbulent world.
Okay, so when everything else is uncertain, politics, borders, the economy, the public looks for something solid.
And the monarchy is a symbol. If the symbol is messy, chaotic, and unfaithful, the nation feels that instability. By staying loyal, by having that unshakable marriage, George V protected the crown from scandal.
So in a way, his marriage was a shield.
A shield and an anchor. The source says he demonstrated that love can thrive even under pressure. It wasn't about tabloids for him, it was about dignity.
His personal life was the one thing that didn't add to the noise.
It was a strategic asset. He made the royal family boring in the best possible way.
That is such a cool perspective. We usually think of strategy as moving troops. But here, loyalty is a tool for survival.
Precisely. It elevated fidelity from a private choice to a public duty. He showed that you can't control the world, but you can control your own house. And that gave people confidence.
Okay, we have to move to the next one, because this is a story that I think touches the emotional core of the source the most. George VI.
George VI. The text calls this section Silence and Sacrifice.
Now, most people know George VI as the reluctant king.
Right.
The father of Queen Elizabeth II. The source confirms this. He never sought power.
He inherited the throne unexpectedly, and the source highlights his vulnerability. It mentions his insecurities and self-doubt. We know he struggled with the stammer. He hated the spotlight.
Which makes his story so much more human to me. He's not this swaggering monarch. He's anxious. He's got the weight of the world on his shoulders. And yet, the source says one thing defined him: his devotion to Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother.
It paints a picture of complete dedication, honoring her through illness, doubt, and public expectation.
There's a phrase in the source regarding George VI that I really want to discuss. It describes his loyalty as revolutionary.
Yes, revolutionary.
Why revolutionary? He's just being a good husband, right? Isn't that the baseline?
Well, look at the context provided. In a court where affairs were the norm, his silence and fidelity spoke louder than words.
Silence and fidelity.
We often think of revolution as loud protests, speeches, wars. But here, the revolution was quiet. It was the revolution of not doing what was expected of a powerful man.
So just by being quiet and faithful, he was making a huge statement.
A huge one. And there's that quote you highlighted earlier.
Fidelity is a radical act when the world assumes indulgence is inevitable.
That is the core thesis, isn't it? When the world assumes you will indulge, when it assumes you will take what you want because you can, simply not doing it becomes radical. It disrupts the narrative.
It's defying gravity.
It is. It's George VI saying, I have the power to do anything, and I choose to do this one thing. Stay true.
It's powerful because it's so contrary to what we assume human nature is when given unlimited power.
And it connects back to his insecurities. I think the source is implying something psychological here. Perhaps because he felt that self-doubt, his anchor in Queen Elizabeth was even more vital.
That's a really deep point. Insecurity often drives people to seek validation everywhere. Like, I need everyone to love me because I don't love myself.
But for him, it drove him deeper into one relationship. He found his strength in that commitment.
So we've looked at these four kings. We've gone from social pressure to political pressure to psychological pressure. When you step back and look at the whole picture, what are we actually seeing here?
We're seeing their humanity. The text explicitly states that power doesn't excuse betrayal and privilege doesn't guarantee happiness.
And that temptation tests character, not desire.
That is a critical distinction to make. Everyone feels desire. Kings, paupers, everyone. But temptation is the test of character.
And the source argues that these kings remind us that behind the ceremony, they were flawed human beings who struggled. I think that's the part I love most. They weren't robots programmed to be good.
Not at all. They were men who had to make a choice. The source calls it a daily choice.
Yes. Loyalty isn't a one-time decision. It is, as the text says, courage in the shadows.
Courage in the shadows. That's evocative, isn't it?
It is. It means doing the right thing when there is no audience to applaud you.
In fact, as we saw with Edward and William, the audience might even be booing you. They might be ridiculing you or isolating you.
So true. It's easy to be good when everyone is watching and cheering. It's hard to be good when being bad is the cool thing to do.
Precisely. And the source tries to connect this to us, the listeners. Obviously, none of us are British kings.
Unlikely. Though, if you are, hello, Your Majesty. Thanks for downloading.
But the struggles are relatable. The source lists them. The choice between convenience and commitment.
And the challenge of doing right when no one is watching. That is universal, whether you're ruling an empire or just trying to navigate your own career and relationships.
The option to take the easy route, the convenient route, is always there. And usually that's the one that betrays someone else or betrays your own values.
Exactly. These kings demonstrate that integrity requires effort. It requires a willingness to be uncomfortable.
And that brings us to the ultimate lesson here. History usually remembers conquest and war. We remember the guys who blew things up.
The loud ones.
But Crowns of Commitment argues that integrity, courage, and love matter most. In a world obsessed with gossip, loyalty is actually a revolutionary story.
It really is. It proves that character can survive absolute power. If you can stay decent when you have the power to be a monster, that's the ultimate test.
So what does this all mean for us today?
I think it calls us to redefine what we admire. We're often drawn to the charismatic, the loud, the scandalous figures. But perhaps we should look closer at the quiet ones.
The ones practicing silence and sacrifice.
Precisely. You know, there's this final thought that's been sticking with me from the source. It keeps coming back to this idea of silence and shadows. And it makes me wonder,
So on?
if history focuses so much on the loud scandals, the things that scream for attention, maybe the most powerful things occurring in our own lives are the quiet choices we make that don't make the headlines.
The moments of restraint that no one else ever sees, the harsh word you didn't say, the corner you didn't cut.
Exactly. The battles we win in our own heads, where we choose duty over desire, not because we'll get a medal for it, but just because it's who we want to be.
That is the true legacy of these kings, not the lands they ruled, but the impulses they conquered.
Well, that is a lot to think about. Next time you're faced with a choice between the easy way and the right way, just remember, if a king with absolute power can choose the hard road, maybe we can too. Thanks for diving in with us.
It was a pleasure.
See you next time.